Today we're going to be diving into one of the most dynamic environments on our planet, the intertidal zone. This is the narrow band of coastline that sits between the high and low tide lines. It might look calm when the tide is out, but it's actually one of the most extreme and competitive ecosystems on Earth. Life here has to adapt not just to living in water, but to surviving on land for parts of the day too. By the end of this lecture, you'll see how organisms in this zone have evolved remarkable strategies to handle constant change. The intertidal zone lies between the mean low and mean high tides. Below it is just the subtidal zones, which stays submerged no matter what. Think of the intertidal zone as the ocean's edge habitat, sometimes drenched, sometimes dry. During low tides, this area is exposed to sunlight, wind, and predators. During high tide, it becomes part of the ocean again. Not all intertidal zones are created equal. Some are rocky, sharp cliffs, tide pools, or boulder fields, while others are soft bottom like sandy beaches or muddy flats. The type of substrate or bottom determines which organisms can thrive there. For example, barnacles have a solid surface to anchor to, while clams and worms prefer soft sediment that they can burrow into. We categorize organisms based on where they live. Epifauna live on the surface, like barnacles or snails grazing on rocks. Infauna live within the sediment. Think of clams digging down to safety. And then there's the meiofauna, tiny creatures living between the grains of sand. It's like the entire microscopic world hidden beneath our feet. Each group faces different challenges, but all have evolved clever ways to survive exposure and movement between the two worlds. Living between the tides sounds romantic, but it's a tough gig. Organisms deal with desiccation or drying out, as well as extreme temperatures and salinity shifts. Feeding gets interrupted when the tides retreat, and when the waves themselves can be powerful enough to rip creatures right off the rocks. Even oxygen can run low when water disappears. Despite all of this, life thrives here. One of the biggest threats to the intertidal zone is desiccation or drying out. When the tide goes out, many organisms are suddenly left exposed to the air and sun. On hot, dry, or even windy days, water loss can happen so fast. So survival depends on how well these organisms can hold on to moisture. This is where we see some fascinating behavioral and structural adaptations that make the difference between life and death. There's two main strategies to handle drying out: hiding or climbing up. Some animals, like crabs or sea stars, retreat into moist crevices or tide pools where water lingers. Others, like barnacles or oysters, simply close up shop, literally. They seal themselves off from the environment by closing their shells tightly. This helps them retain moisture, but it comes at a cost. They can't feed or breathe until the tide returns. So low tide is a trade-off between staying hydrated and staying alive. Temperature swings are brutal in the tidal zones. Imagine being doused in cold seawater, then baking in the sun for a few hours later. Organisms here experience both extremes daily. Some have light-colored shells to reflect heat, while others use evaporative cooling or clusters together to conserve moisture. Tide pools can heat up quickly, but interestingly, some creatures can tolerate a much wider temperature range than most terrestrial animals. Salinity is another roller coaster. Rain can dilute salt water dramatically, while evaporation in tide pools can send them skyrocketing. The average ocean is about 33 to 35 parts per thousand, but the intertidal can swing widely beyond that. This is why most intertidal organisms are euhaline. They can tolerate big changes in salinity. Compare that to the stenohaline subtidal species, which live in more stable conditions and struggle with even small fluctuations. Just to picture this, salinity in a tide pool can start at about 20% in the morning and climb to about 40% by the afternoon as water evaporates. If a sudden storm rolls in, that same pool can drop back down nearly to freshwater levels. Combine that with temperature shifts of over 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and you have constantly changing environments that test every organism's limit. Survival here really is about endurance and adaptability. Feeding is another daily challenge. Filter feeders like mussels and barnacles depend on the tide to bring them food, so when they clam up, their meals stop coming. Some species, like snails, keep feeding during low tide by scraping algae off rocks, but that's rare. For many animals in regions of semi-diurnal tides, 2 highs and 2 lows per day, that means they spend nearly half their lives fasting. Timing is everything when it comes to feeding in this intertidal zone. Then there's the constant pounding of waves. For rocky shores dwellers, this is an everyday battle. Waves can slam with enough force to knock loose even the most stubborn organisms. To survive, they evolve strong attachments. Barnacles use natural cement, seaweed, anchors, and holdfasts, and limpets have muscular feet that create suction. These adaptations don't just keep them in place, they also shape where and how different species can live along in the shores. When the tides retreat, oxygen can quickly become scarce. Animals that close up to avoid drying out also trap in air inside, which means no new oxygen comes in and carbon dioxide builds up. In tide pools, it's even trickier. Oxygen can run out at night even when algae stops photosynthesizing and starts respiring. Some species have developed the ability to breathe both air and water. Switching between systems depends on their conditions. Space is prime real estate in the intertidal zone. On rocky shores, there's only so much surface area that organisms to attach to, and competition gets fierce. Soft-bottom communities also face crowding as many animals compete for stable spots like oyster shells or small rocks to cling to. This is a constant battle for space, driving fascinating interactions like overgrowth, pushing, or even chemical warfare between some species. All these factors, exposure, temperature, salinity, and space, create clear zones along the shores. The upper intertidal is harsh and dry, home to the toughest organisms. The middle intertidal is more moderate, and the lower intertidal stays wet most of the time, supporting more biodiversity. As we move down the shores, conditions get extreme, but competition ramps up. It's a perfect example of how environmental gradients shape biological communities. Competition is fierce in the intertidal zone because space and resources are limited. When the tide is in, organisms compete for food. When it's out, they compete for shelter and moisture. Some species are simply better at it. Barnacles, for example, can overgrow others and monopolize rock surfaces. But when storms or waves disturb the community, new space opens up and the cycle of recolonization begins. This process, known as ecological succession, leads to predictable stages as new species move in. Over time, the area stabilizes into what is called a climax community, a balanced long-term arrangement of species until the next disturbance resets it all. Predators play an equally powerful role. Sea stars, for instance, are keystone predators, meaning their presence controls the structure of the community. If you remove sea stars, mussels can take over entire rock faces, reducing biodiversity. Experiments where scientists physically remove sea stars showed just how dramatically this affects species diversity. So, even in small strips of coastline, predator-prey relationships maintain balance and prevent any one species from dominating the ecosystem. Zonation isn't just about exposure to the air, it's also about biology. The upper limits of where an organism lives are often determined by physical stress, how much desiccation or heat they can actually handle. But the lower limits are often set by biological factors like competition and predation. For example, a type of barnacle might tolerate living lower on the rocks, but gets outcompeted by another species or even by sea stars. The resulting pattern creates beautiful distinct bands of lines across the shore, like stripes that tell the story of both environmental stress and ecological interactions. Not every intertidal zone is rocky. Many are made up of soft sediments like sand, silt, or clay. The size of where the grains determines how much oxygen seeps into the substrate. Coarser sand allows water and oxygen to flow more easily, while fine mud can become oxygen poor. In those muddy environments, only certain types of organisms can thrive. Most of these are infauna, burrowing that live below the surface like worms and clams. Their tunnels are circulated oxygen and nutrients, keeping the system alive beneath the surface. In very fine sediment, the lower layers often become anoxic, completely without oxygen. Down there, anaerobic bacteria take over, breaking down organic material and releasing gases that give mudflats the distinct smell. Animals that live in these conditions need special adaptations, like long siphons or tubes that reach up for oxygen-rich surface. While you won't see as many epifauna in these soft bottoms, the hidden world below the sediment is bursting with life. It's a reminder that even in environments that look barren or still, there is incredible complexity and constant activity happening just out of sight.